All right, I'm back for chapter 11, 12, and 13 to finish out the book. Werewolves Don't Go to Summer Camp, and I'm reading this with permission from Scholastic. Chapter 11 is called Pussycat. The next day, as Mr. Jenkins wasn't at breakfast. As a matter of fact, he wasn't anywhere in sight. Maybe he vanished like the boy in the legend, Liza whispered. Eddie shook his head. I bet he's just resting up for tonight. One of the other camp counselors interrupted with an announcement. Mr. Jenkins isn't feeling well this morning. He's suffering from an allergic reaction. Howie poked Eddie in the ribs. It's the wolfsbane and mistletoe, he whispered. Eddie agreed. If he wasn't a werewolf, he wouldn't be sick. The camp counselor continued. Hopefully he'll be feeling better in time for our night hike. Do you mean we still have to go? Melody asked the counselor. Oh, yes, the camp counselor said. Mr. Jenkins wouldn't want to miss tonight's full moon. He would just die if he didn't get to go. Well, we might die if we do go, Eddie mumbled. While you're hiking with Mr. Jenkins, the camp counselor continued, we have to clean out the cabins. You mean the other camp counselors won't be going? Melody gulped. No, Mr. Jenkins said he could handle it by himself, said the counselor. So for the rest of the day, we'll take it easy. We don't want you to be too tired for tonight. Howie, Melody, Liza, and Eddie tried all day to think of ways to get out of going on the night hike. By lunchtime, they were worried sick. I can't eat anything, Melody said, holding up a soggy taco. I'm too worried about tonight. Liza bit into her taco. You might as well eat now. It might be our last meal, Howie agreed. Yeah, we better get some food. We may need our strength for whatever happens tonight. Look, Melody whispered. It's Mr. Jenkins. She pointed to the table at the other side of the dining hall. There sat a very pale Mr. Jenkins. What do you think of that? That can't be Mr. Jenkins. He isn't Harry, Eddie said, shaking his head. But it is, Melody insisted. Look at the dog tags around his neck. Mr. Jenkins hardly looked like himself. He wore his dog tags, but now he had on Nike tennis shoes and clean blue jeans. His orange t-shirt was clean too. His hair was neatly combed and pulled back into a ponytail, and no trace of beard was left. Indeed, it was hard to believe he'd ever been Harry. Sure, he still had hair on his arms, but it didn't look as thick now. Wow, that wolfsbane and mistletoe must have worked. Howie looked amazed. Liza agreed. That must be some powerful stuff. As long as he's around those plants, we don't have anything to worry about, Howie said. We'll be safe until we go home tomorrow. We don't have to worry about that night hike now, Eddie smiled. You said it, Melody agreed. Mr. Jenkins looks more like a pussycat than a werewolf. Chapter 12, Almost Midnight. The night sky was dark as ink, but the full moon lit the trail with an eerie, silvery glow as the campers followed Mr. Jenkins up the dirt trail. I've never seen anything like it, Melody said. Nobody could grow hair that fast, Liza agreed. No human, that is, Eddie added. Already, thick black stubble covered Mr. Jenkins' face. His hair was tangled again, and even his arms looked hairier. The wolfsbane and mistletoe must not affect him when he's away from it for too long, Howie declared. If only we had saved some, maybe we'd have a chance, Melody wailed and stumbled over a root sticking out of the trail. Maybe we could find some more, Eddie said. After all, we are in the woods. No way, Howie moaned. Remember how long it took us to find the first time? And it was in daylight. Liza clicked on her little pocket flashlight and said softly, I still have some left. What? They all cried together. I saved some of my mistletoe. I thought I could keep it until Christmas. Liza pulled out a very crushed clump of leaves from her pocket of her jeans. Liza, you're fantastic, Eddie said, grabbing it from her hand. Now, we just have to get close to him. Howie pointed to Mr. Jenkins, who was far ahead on the trail. That won't be easy. He's getting hairier by the minute. I wonder how long it takes him to turn into a werewolf, Melody said. It shouldn't be long now, Eddie gasped as he looked at the glow-in-the-dark watch. It's almost midnight, and look, he's taking off his shoes. The four campers gasped as Mr. Jenkins untied both Nike tennis shoes and kicked them to the side of the trail. The other campers didn't notice that Mr. Jenkins was changing in front of their very eyes. Half the kids looked like they were already asleep, and the rest were hooting and hollering about being able to be in the woods so late. "Come on," Eddie said. "It's up to us to save everybody." Howie, Liza, Melody, and Eddie ignored the complaints and shoves of the other campers as they pushed their way to the front of the group. Finally, they were right behind Mr. Jenkins. Eddie used all the skill of a pickpocket as he inched closer. Holding his breath, he dropped the mistletoe into Mr. Jenkins' backpack. He didn't dare breathe until he rejoined his friend. "You did it," Howie whispered as he patted Eddie on the back. "I just hope it's not too late," Eddie sighed. There he is, putting it into the backpack. Chapter 13, The Lone Wolf. It wasn't long before Mr. Jenkins started to scratch. "It's working," Eddie said as he grabbed Howie's arm. "Thank goodness," Howie cried. Mr. Jenkins was scratching like a dog with fleas by the time they reached the top of the hill. He turned to face the kids. His eyes looked red and teary. "We'll stop here and rest," he growled. Everybody dropped to the ground and slipped off their backpacks. Even Mr. Jenkins. "Oh no," Melody exclaimed. "Mr. Jenkins took off his backpack." "Now what are we going to do?" Liza whined. Howie tried to stay calm. "As long as he's near the mistletoe, we should be safe." At that moment, Mr. Jenkins stood up. He scratched his beard and announced, "I'm going to scout the trail ahead of us," he said. "You kids sit tight." With that, he walked off into the night, leaving his backpack and the campers behind. "We're dead now," Liza gasped. Without the mistletoe nearby, he's going to turn into a werewolf." "There's nothing we can do but stick together," Howie said quietly. "We better tell the rest of the kids about Mr. Jenkins. That way everyone will be prepared." Melody, Liza, and Eddie nodded. They turned and faced the other campers. "You're crazy," one of them said when Eddie finished telling them about Mr. Jenkins. "Yeah," a little girl in front agreed. "I don't believe in werewolves. There's no such thing." "I think you've watched too many movies," a boy said in the back. "But haven't you noticed how hairy Mr. Jenkins is?" interrupted Melody. "And he's allergic to the plants that are used to cure werewolves," Liza added. "So, I'm allergic to a lot of plants," a girl with pigtails said. "And I'm not a werewolf." The rest of the kids started laughing and making fun of Howie, Liza, Eddie, and Melody. They were so busy giggling that they didn't notice the clinking sound from the trees near the trail. Then a low growl sounded from one of the bushes. One by one, the other kids got quiet. "What's that?" Howie whispered. Nobody answered as the growls grew a little bit louder. "Maybe it's just a dog," a girl in a red jacket said. Just then, whatever it was in the bushes darted back into the woods. There was enough moonlight to show the glimmer of dog tags. "That's no dog!" Melody exclaimed. "Dogs don't run on two legs!" "And dogs aren't that big," cried Eddie. Do you see? And then they heard it. A howl that started out low. It grew louder and louder until it seemed as if the woods were filled with the cry of the lone wolf. "It's the werewolf!" Melody yelled. "Run for your lives!" The campers turned and fled. Even though they were scared, they remembered to stay on the trail. They didn't stop until they were safe in their cabins. The dining hall was quiet the next morning as all the campers thoughtfully chewed on a rubbery sausage. Mr. Jenkins sat at a table all by himself. The black stubble on his face was almost a full beard, and his hair looked like it had pieces of dry leaves and twigs stuck in it. His clothes were worn and dirty. He didn't say a word about the hike. The bus arrived after breakfast. All the campers dragged their blue Bailey school gym bags onto the bus and found a place to sit down. Eddie and Howie headed toward the back of the bus. Liza and Melody sat right in front of them. "I'm sure glad camp is over," Liza said. Several kids sitting nearby nodded. "We're just lucky to get away before Mr. Jenkins ate us," Howie said. "Do you really believe Mr. Jenkins is a werewolf?" a scrawny boy across the aisle asked. "You have to admit," Eddie said slowly, "Mr. Jenkins is no ordinary camp counselor." The kids on the bus stared at each other. You can say that again, Melody said. The campers peered out the window as the bus slowly began to move. There stood Mr. Jenkins. He waved and scratched his beard. Then he took a deep breath and howled the call of the lone wolf. I hope you have enjoyed the Bailey School Kids. Werewolves Don't Go to Summer Camp. If you enjoyed this book, there's a whole bunch more in this series, The Adventures of the Bailey School Kids, written by Debbie Dady and Marcia Thornton Jones.